A humble girl is thrown out of the mall by security guards until the millionaire arrives and changes the scene. Amidst the glittering luxury of New York, Mary only wanted shelter from the rain when she was treated like an unwanted intruder, humiliated in front of a crowd that preferred to laugh and film rather than help her. What no one imagined was that, in that moment of shame and pain, fate would place in her path a powerful man who would change the course of history, and the truth that would emerge would reveal far more than anyone was prepared to see. New York's most luxurious shopping mall was crowded on that rainy afternoon when Mary, wearing a simple dress and carrying a broken umbrella, entered just to shelter from the cold wind. She was walking timidly between shiny shop windows until she was approached by two security guards who loudly demanded that she leave. The scene quickly caught the attention of customers. Some stopped to watch, others raised their phones to film. That manager rushed in and scornfully accused Mary of driving away real customers. His words echoed like a cruel sentence, drawing quiet laughter from a group of young people. One of the security guards snatched Mary's battered purse, which fell to the floor, scattering coins, an old notebook and a small photo of her deceased mother. People looked on with contempt, and Mary, embarrassed, tried to crouch down to pick it up, but was pushed away. The silence that followed was even more humiliating. No one stood up to defend her. Suddenly, firm footsteps echoed between the marble columns. A man in an impeccable suit, with a serious expression and an imposing presence, approached. It was Alexander Carter, the millionaire owner of the mall. The crowd murmured in shock, and the security guards tensed. Mary, still kneeling, didn't notice his shadow hovering over her until she felt a firm hand pick up the fallen photo. Alexander handed her the image with an intense look, as if the childlike face depicted were a reminder of something he already knew. The crowd, once curious and cruel, was now paralyzed. What had seemed like just another shameful expulsion had turned into an inexplicable scene. The most powerful man in the place, silently, seemed to recognize in that humble girl something none of the others saw. Mary raised her teary eyes, and for an instant, the social order of the room was inverted. If this scene touched your heart, like it now and subscribe to the channel. Stories like Mary's deserve to be remembered, and your reaction helps spread this message of silent justice. The rainy afternoon in New York tinged the sky a heavy gray, reflected in the glass windows of the city's most expensive shopping mall. Inside, golden lights illuminated impeccable marble corridors. Shops displayed thousands of dollars in dresses, and rare perfumes filled the air. Amidst curious tourists and elegant clients, every detail seemed calculated to flaunt wealth. It was into this setting that Mary, with timid steps, her simple dress clinging to her body, damp from the rain, entered seeking shelter. She carried a worn purse, the stitching already coming apart, and a broken umbrella that had barely withstood the biting wind outside. Her presence stood out like a stain of reality amidst the luxurious artificiality. Mary walked slowly, her curious eyes scanning the bright hallways, but each step was accompanied by sidelong glances. A couple looked her up and down with disdain, whispering and snickering. Two young women carrying designer bags stared at her as if her passing were an affront. Mary didn't seem to mind, or at least pretended not to notice, because deep down she carried a quiet dignity, a kind of strength that poverty had never managed to rob her of. However, the mall security guards, alert for any sign of aesthetic disarray, soon noticed her. Two tall men in black suits and cold expressions approached and blocked her path. The sound of a radio strapped to one of their shoulders broke the air. "We have an intruder in the central section." Mary, not understanding, tried to smile shyly and explain that she just wanted to wait out the rain, perhaps find a cheap gift for her younger sister. But her voice was drowned out by the harsh tone that demanded, "This is no place for you." The atmosphere around her changed. People stopped to watch, some discreetly filming with their cell phones, others simply moved away, as if her mere presence could sully the atmosphere. The manager of one of the stores hurried out, adjusting his expensive jacket and saying loudly that people like her scare away serious customers. The words cut like blades. Mary felt her face burn, Her hands tremble as she held her purse, but before she could react, one of the security guards snatched the item from her hands. The purse fell to the floor, scattering coins, an old notebook with scribbles of unfinished dreams, and a small yellowed photograph of her deceased mother. The dry sound echoed through the hallway, followed by muffled laughter and judgmental looks. Mary ducked hurriedly, her heart racing, trying to gather her belongings before they were trampled. But one of the security guards, impatient, gave her a gentle shove to speed her exit. The air grew heavy, almost unbearable. Mary felt the humiliation like a hot wave rising in her chest, pressing down on her breath. Her mind screamed for help, but her lips remained sealed, unable to plead for help from an audience that preferred to watch as if it were free entertainment. It was at that precise moment, with tears threatening to spill over and her dignity about to shatter on the marble floor, that something unexpected happened. Firm footsteps echoed down the hall, causing all eyes to shift. Mary always carried a mixture of pain and resilience in her eyes. Those who saw her walking the streets of New York in simple clothes and a withdrawn posture could never have imagined the weight that life had already placed on her shoulders. Her childhood was marked by the absence of almost everything: lack of money, lack of opportunities, and, above all, lack of stable affection. The daughter of a single mother who struggled with 2 jobs to keep the minimum bills paid, Mary grew up learning early to swallow tears and transform pain into silence. As a child, she watched her schoolmates with colorful lunchboxes and new clothes, while her reality was sharing a makeshift sandwich and wearing donated shoes that always seemed a size too big for her feet. Her teachers noticed her shyness and withdrawn manner, but few knew that many nights Mary went to sleep hungry, holding her younger sister's hand to soothe her on an empty stomach. Her father, a name that never had a face. Abandonment was the first scar she learned to bear, an invisible wound that still made her question why she hadn't been enough to keep him. Her mother's death, years later, left an irreparable void. Mary was only 17. When she held that old portrait, the same one now lying on the mall floor, as a reminder of the only true embrace she had ever known, the responsibility of caring for her younger sister fell on her fragile shoulders, and it was then that the girl became a woman before her time. She worked as a waitress, a cleaner, and a coffee shop attendant. Every penny was counted. Every exhausting night was compensated by the silent promise not to let her sister go through the same pain she had endured. The world, however, seemed to conspire against her perseverance. Friends turned away, distant relatives closed their doors, and even neighbors preferred to turn their faces away rather than offer help. Mary learned to stand on her own 2 feet, to hold her head high even when the shame of poverty tried to drag her down. Deep down, she knew there was no time for self-pity. If she wanted to survive, she would need to be stronger than any humiliation. Still, there was a persistent, almost naive dream within her, the desire to study, to get a decent job, to prove to herself that she wasn't defined by the clothes she wore or the coins she carried in her purse. Sometimes, in the silence of the rented room she shared with her sister, Mary would write in her old notebook, the same one that had now been scattered before the eyes of strangers, phrases of hope, simple goals, small plans that, to her, meant the world. It was this hidden strength, shaped by abandonment and pain, that kept Mary going. Even when it seemed impossible. Every tear swallowed, every humiliation suffered, every night of hunger became fuel to carry on. She didn't know it, but fate was about to place her story in the path of someone who, however powerful, also carried secrets and wounds that no amount of money could erase. And deep down in her soul, without even realizing it, Mary was already ready to be the test. The mall was bustling on a Friday afternoon. Groups of young people gathered in front of the designer. Stores, showing off their newly purchased handbags and laughing loudly, as if the space were the stage for a private show. Mary, shrunken in her simplicity, simply walked discreetly, trying to blend in with them, but the difference was glaring. While the others carried luxury bags, she carried only her notebook and a few coins. It was then that a seemingly banal scene became the trigger for her humiliation. 2 wealthy young women, daughters of influential businessmen, noticed her presence. One of them, with a mocking air, commented loudly for all to hear, She must be here just to window shop because she could never afford a single button of those clothes. The other laughed, encouraging the sarcasm, but they didn't stop there. They decided to make a cruel bet in front of the group that accompanied them. They challenged Mary to enter one of the most expensive stores and choose something to try on, just to see how far her poor courage would go. Mary hesitated. Her eyes shone with embarrassment, but at the same time a strange force drove her. Perhaps it was the memory of her sister. Perhaps it was the need to prove she didn't need to bow her head. Then, with firm steps, she approached the brightly lit entrance of the shop, her heart pounding. As soon as she crossed the threshold, she felt all eyes fall on her. Saleswomen with disdainful expressions, wealthy customers watching as if they were seeing an intruder on sacred territory. The tension was mounting by the second. Mary, her hands trembling, held a simple dress, simple by the store's standards but exorbitantly priced. As she gazed at the piece, one of the young women secretly filmed, muttering, "This will be a good laugh later." The manager, uncomfortable, approached. Loudly for all to hear, he asked if she really could be there. Mary tried to answer, but her voice was lost in the muffled laughter of the group waiting at the entrance. It was then that the order to call security was given. The bet had turned into a spectacle, and Mary, without realizing it, had become the main attraction in a scene set to her shame. As the men in black suits approached, the whispers grew louder, and cell phones were raised to record the moment. The humiliation was no longer silent but public, charged with the cruelty typical of those who find pleasure in seeing someone else belittled. Mary clutched the dress she could never afford to her chest, as if it were a fragile shield against the world around her. With every step the security guards took, she felt the weight of injustice crushing her dignity. And it was at this point, at the height of tension, that fate would begin to write the twist that would change not only her life, but also the lives of those watching with arrogant eyes. When security grabbed Mary's arm to forcibly remove her, she was still clutching her dress, as if this were her last chance to prove she deserved to be there. Her frail body contrasted with the brutality of the scene, and the crowd watched in complicit silence, as if it were just another gratuitous spectacle. It was at that moment that a different kind of silence took over the room. Someone's firm footsteps echoed on the marble floor, causing the security guards to hesitate for a second. Alexander Carter walked with the imposing posture of someone who didn't need to announce his presence. His tailored suit reflected the golden light of the mall, and his fixed eyes conveyed the authority of a man accustomed to deciding the fate of entire companies with a single signature. The crowd murmured in shock. The mall owner was there, witnessing the most embarrassing scene of the afternoon. Mary, still bent over, looked up and saw the man. There was something strange about the encounter. His gaze wasn't one of simple reprimand for the security guards or curiosity about the scandal. It was a deep look, as if he recognized something in her that others couldn't see. Alexander slowly bent down, picked up the yellowed photograph of Mary's mother from the floor, and handed it back to her silently. The gesture, simple and almost imperceptible, contrasted sharply with the cruelty of those who had humiliated her. The confused security guards waited for orders. The nervous manager tried to justify himself, saying he was simply maintaining the mall's image. But Alexander didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on Mary, as if searching for answers in her face. She, weak, simply clutched the photo to her chest, unable to understand why this powerful man would care about a stranger. The silence stretched on until Alexander, in a low but firm voice, ordered, "Let her go." The security guards immediately backed away. A murmur ran through the crowd. The humiliation had just been interrupted by the owner himself. But there was more to it than that. What no one noticed was the discomfort in Alexander's eyes. That photograph he had held for a brief moment had awakened a buried memory, a fragment of the past he had struggled to forget. Mary, stunned, tried to thank him, but the words died on her lips. She couldn't tell whether she felt gratitude, distrust, or simply relief at no longer being dragged like a criminal. Alexander, for his part, said nothing more. He simply stood and cast a cold look at the group of young people who had initiated the provocation. Their laughter ceased instantly, and in that moment, even without understanding, Mary realized something bigger was happening. It wasn't just a millionaire defending a humble girl. It was as if the invisible threads of fate had crossed, forcing them into an inevitable connection. A connection that would soon reveal the entire hallway seemed to breathe a sigh of silence after Alexander's order. The security guards stepped aside, but their gazes remained fixed on Mary like invisible knives. To many there, she was still just a poor intruder who shouldn't have walked through those doors. The momentary relief of the intervention soon turned into a kind of collective judgment. Murmurs began to spread. She must be faking it to get attention. Maybe she's a con artist looking for easy money. Each comment was crueler than the last, and Mary felt the weight of those words, as if the marble floor had turned to quicksand beneath her feet. The manager, still trying to save face, dared to speak out loud in front of everyone. "Mr. Carter, that girl shouldn't be here. People like her devalue the place." The phrase, loaded with prejudice, echoed like a final sentence. The group of young men who had initiated the bet chuckled, as if Mary's humiliation was still ongoing. It was a spectacle that refused to end, even with the presence of the most powerful man in the place. Mary lowered her head in silence. The dress she held in her hands now felt like a huge weight, as if it carried within it all the unspoken accusations society had imposed on her. He tried to return the garment to the rack, but his fingers trembled. The shame came not just from the security guards or the manager, but from the crowd that watched like merciless judges, without moving a muscle to defend her. Alexander watched everything, and a sense of unease grew within him, not only because of the unfair scene, but because of the feeling that he had seen something similar before. That photograph throbbed in his memory, and every tear in Mary's eyes felt all too familiar. Still, he maintained his rigid posture, trying not to reveal the turmoil that was beginning to unfold within him. One of the security guards, not fully understanding the situation, tried to approach Mary again, this time more restrained, as if awaiting approval, and it was at that moment that the crowd's cruelty reached its peak. One of the wealthy young women raised her voice, feigning innocence. "She just wants attention, Mr. Carter. If she were worthy of being here, she'd have money in her pocket, not coins falling on the floor." Laughter echoed, and Mary felt her legs weaken. It was the culmination of public humiliation. It wasn't enough to be expelled. It wasn't enough to be judged. She had to be turned into an example, a spectacle. Mary's heart beat fast, and the memory of all the times life had pushed her to the ground seemed to replay itself before a cruel audience. But she, firm in her silent dignity, didn't cry. She simply clutched the photograph to her chest as if it were an invisible shield against all that contempt. Alexander then stepped forward. Silence returned abruptly, as if his mere presence had the power to stop the laughter. His eyes fixed on the manager and then moved to the group of young people. He didn't need to raise his voice. He simply said, in a deep tone that carried more weight than any shout, "You're the ones who are devaluing this place." The sentence fell like thunder. The crowd shuddered, but no one dared respond. It was the first time anyone had reversed logic, calling into question not Mary's poverty, but the arrogance of those who humiliated her. Mary didn't know it, but that would be just the first of many silent battles in which her truth would begin to come to light, forever changing the destiny of the man who now defended her before everyone. The silence that hung after Alexander's intervention still seemed heavy in the air. Mary stood, her dress still in her hands, her eyes teary, but her posture erect as if refusing to bow to contempt. The crowd slowly dispersed, but a few curious glances persisted, as if expecting an immediate outcome. Alexander kept his expression firm, trying to hide the uneasiness growing within him. That encounter had shaken him more than he cared to admit. It was then that Mary, in an unexpected gesture, raised her face and spoke in a voice calm yet filled with surprising strength. "Don't think I don't know who you are, Mr. Carter." The words came as a shock. The security guards glanced at each other. The manager swallowed hard. And even the few customers still watching the scene approached curious. Alexander stared at her silently, trying to decipher if this was just another attempt at attention or if there was something hidden behind that statement. Mary took a deep breath, clutching the photograph she'd rescued to her chest. I knew exactly what I was getting into when I stepped into this mall. I knew I'd be looked at as a mistake, like a foreign body amidst all this artificial glitter. But I also knew that sooner or later you'd show up, because this place bears your mark in every detail. And I've seen that mark before, back when you weren't the man everyone reveres today. The revelation fell like a silent bombshell. Alexander, accustomed to controlling narratives, felt vulnerable in the face of those words. The air around him seemed heavier, as if each syllable Mary spoke carried the force of a truth impossible to ignore. He didn't respond immediately, but his eyes betrayed a frantic search for hidden memories. Mary, for her part, no longer looked like the humiliated girl she'd been minutes before. There was a firmness in her posture, a dignity that contrasted with the simplicity of her clothes. "Do you think I came here by chance? Do you think this scene was just bad luck or coincidence? I came knowing they'd look at me with contempt because I wanted you to see it. I wanted you to remember it." The words echoed loudly. No one understood exactly what was happening, but everyone felt the weight of that hinted secret. Alexander took a deep breath, looking away for a brief moment, as if trying to reorganize the fragments of memory that were surfacing in his mind. Mary didn't elaborate. This wasn't the time to reveal everything. Her low, firm voice concluded the scene with a strange mixture of defiance and serenity. "I knew everything from the beginning," she repeated, before placing the dress back on the rack with her hands still trembling. Silence reigned for a few seconds, until Alexander's heart began to pound, with the uneasy feeling that this humble girl was no ordinary stranger, but someone whose past connected to his in a way he could no longer ignore. Alexander had always been a man of few words in public, but at that moment not even his silence seemed enough to hide the turmoil building within him. Mary's words echoed from a past he had buried beneath contracts, figures, and glass walls. "I knew everything from the beginning." That sentence wouldn't leave his mind. As she slowly walked away, packing her belongings, Alexander felt he had to face it head-on. In the minutes that followed, after the crowd dispersed and the security guards retreated, he asked no one else to interfere. He followed Mary with firm but hesitant steps to one of the mall's less crowded corridors. When he finally managed to speak, his voice was deep, but with a crack he rarely let slip. "Who are you?" Mary turned. Her eyes, still teary, held no fear. They held history. And it was with just one look that memories began to open in Alexander's mind. The photograph he had held minutes before, the expression of the woman in the portrait, the similarities to Mary's face, everything came together in one overwhelming rush of memory. He was transported back in time, to a part of his life he would rather never revisit. Years ago, before he was the tycoon the world respected, Alexander lived in a poor neighborhood where Mary's mother worked in a small snack bar. She was a simple but strong woman, known for feeding neighborhood children even when she barely had enough for herself. Alexander, young and ambitious, passed by daily and sometimes discreetly accepted the sandwiches she offered when he didn't have enough money to pay. It was in that same place that he saw Mary as a child, sitting in a corner with the old notebook he now recognized. The shock was immediate. Alexander suddenly understood why her face seemed so familiar. She was the daughter of the woman who had once silently offered him food and dignity amidst his own misery. He, who had conquered the world and forgotten his origins, now found himself confronted with the living legacy of a kindness that had helped him get this far. Mary noticed the change in his gaze. She didn't need to say much, but she still quietly blurted out, "You must remember her, my mother. She was the one who never let you go hungry when you were just a boy with dreams too big for your empty pockets." Alexander felt a crushing weight on his chest. His reputation, built on wealth and power, couldn't erase that truth. Part of who he was existed because of the generosity of that humble woman. And now, standing before her daughter, he saw himself reflected in an uncomfortable mirror. Because all the humiliation Mary had suffered in that luxurious shopping mall was exactly what he had once experienced, and which somehow he had forgotten. The silence between them was thick. Mary didn't smile, didn't seek pity. She just stared at him with a disarming firmness. It was as if she were saying without words, "I know who you really are, and you know who I am too." At that moment, Alexander Carter wasn't the millionaire owner of half an empire. He was simply a man exposed to his silent debt to the past, faced with the daughter of the woman who once helped him survive. In the days following their encounter at the mall, Alexander noticed something he hadn't felt in years. Silence. Not the silence common in his luxurious penthouses, but an emptiness that echoed in every corner, as if something essential were missing. Mary never reappeared. No news, no sign, no shadow of her wandering the halls or the city. It was as if she had vanished, taking with her a part of his memory he could no longer ignore. Alexander continued his routine of meetings, contracts, and corporate dinners, but Mary's image invaded his mind at unexpected moments. In the reflection of a shop window, he thought he saw her teary eyes. In the muffled sound of rain hitting the glass, he remembered how soaked she'd entered the mall. Even in the silence of the early morning hours, when he'd open a bottle of expensive wine to forget the world, the image of her clutching her mother's photograph to her chest would resurface, disturbing. What began as an annoyance turned into a silent obsession. Alexander discreetly asked his assistants to find information about Mary, but little was found. Scant records, simple jobs, frequently. Changed addresses, nothing solid. Her life seemed designed to leave no trace, as if she existed in an invisible space ignored by everyone but him. Meanwhile, the memory of Mary's mother haunted him. How many times had he passed that forgotten diner? How many times had he received a hot meal from her when he didn't even have enough change to pay? And now, so many years later, that woman's daughter had appeared in his empire of glass and steel, only to disappear again, like a ghost from the past, demanding he remember where he came from. Mary's absence began to erode his emotional armor. For the first time in decades, Alexander felt vulnerable. In important meetings, he lost focus. At lavish parties, the music sounded distant. The cold gaze that had always earned him respect now seemed weary, as if carrying an invisible debt. It was as if Mary had taken with her not only her mother's photograph, but also a piece of her own identity. He missed not only her, but the truth she represented. The truth his money, fame, and power had never been able to buy. The memory of a time when he too was fragile, poor, and forgotten. And the more days passed without any sign of Mary, the more Alexander wondered if her disappearance was just a result of circumstances, or if it was part of a greater justice, a silent karma that forced him to confront everything he had left behind. The silence left by Mary's absence already seemed like a heavy burden, but fate decided to further weigh the scales. Alexander, accustomed to dominating headlines with figures and achievements, suddenly found himself at the center of a storm of criticism. It all started with an amateur video that went viral. Mary being pushed by mall security guards, her belongings scattered across the floor, and the group of young people laughing at the humiliation. The most striking detail was the moment Alexander appeared, picked up the photograph, and stared at the girl. Thousands of people began commenting not only on the cruelty of the scene, but on his passivity in the face of it. The video grew like wildfire. Headlines carried harsh phrases. Millionaire defends or humiliates? Alexander Carter's mall expels humble girl. The frozen images showed Mary kneeling on the floor, her dress in her hands, her eyes filled with shame. The internet was unforgiving. For many, it was a portrait of an unequal system, and Alexander, even though he wasn't directly responsible, became the face of the riches. Contempt for the poor. Board meetings were filled with heated arguments. Investors feared a stock price drop, customers boycotted some stores, and protests began to form outside the mall's entrances. People carried signs with slogans like, "Mary is all of us," and "Wealth without humanity is poverty." That space, which had always been a status symbol, was transformed before the public eye into a stage for arrogance and injustice. Alexander tried to respond with formal statements, well written, communications from his marketing team, but nothing seemed enough. Social judgment wasn't just happening in courts or the press, it was happening on the streets, on cell phones, in indignant voices that repeated the same question. Why did he, so powerful, allow this to happen? Why didn't he do more? Deep down, Alexander knew the answer was tied to Mary. He had done more than anyone else at that moment, but not enough to erase the wound. Worse, his hesitation, his delay in acting had been seen as complicity. And while society clamored for justice, the only one who could truly tell who he was had disappeared. The millionaire, accustomed to dictating the rules of the game, was now judged by the invisible court of public opinion. Every glance he received on the street seemed filled with disapproval. Every piece of news reinforced the image of a distant, insensitive man, incapable of remembering his own origins. Alexander began to realize that without Mary, there was no argument, no publicity, campaign, no fortune capable of cleansing his image. Because it wasn't just a matter of reputation, it was a matter of truth. And the truth, painful as it was beginning to crush the empire he had so painstakingly built. The cold, merciless social judgment wasn't just directed at a millionaire. It was directed at a man who, by forgetting where he came from, nearly lost the chance to recognize the one person who could give him back his meaning. Alexander Carter, the man whose signature could move billions, discovered that true power wasn't measured in contracts or glass skyscrapers. The social storm that had descended upon him left him exposed, fragile, almost naked before the world. And at the center of this public wound, a name echoed within his mind: Mary. She wasn't just the girl humiliated in front of everyone. She was the reflection of something he had forgotten, and perhaps even betrayed. With every headline splashed across his face, with every protest surrounding the mall, Alexander felt he was no longer the same man. External judgment served as a mirror for his internal judgment. For the first time in decades, he remembered what it was like to walk around with empty pockets, what it was like to feel his stomach ache from lack of food. He remembered the diner where Mary's mother had offered him bread and dignity, and in the face of that memory, his entire fortune seemed small, almost ridiculous. The early mornings grew long. In his luxurious penthouse, Alexander would spend hours sitting by the window, gazing at the illuminated city, yet feeling plunged into darkness. The glass of whiskey in his hands no longer brought relief. The glamorous parties felt like farces, and even the sound of applause at gala events seemed false and empty. Mary's silence was what hurt the most, because he knew he needed to hear her again, not as a businessman, not as a millionaire, but as a man. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It was slow, silent, and painful. Alexander began to change, first with small gestures. He secretly visited poor neighborhoods, observing children who reminded him of himself, boys who, even with torn clothes, still had a sparkle in their eyes. He donated large sums of money, but realized that the gesture didn't carry the weight of redemption he sought. The real change wasn't in donating money, but in rebuilding what he had allowed to be lost: humanity. His advisors, concerned about his public image, suggested advertising, campaigns, emotional commercials, and rehearsed interviews. But Alexander refused. He didn't want to appear human. He wanted to be human again. He began to distance himself from the circles of power that had previously vied for his presence. He frequented simple coffee shops, walked the streets without the usual escort, and in every ordinary face he searched for a piece of the truth that Mary had awakened in him. Deep down, the transformation was inevitable. The millionaire who had always believed he could buy respect now realized he couldn't buy forgiveness. And that forgiveness, he knew, was in the hands of someone who had disappeared, leaving a void impossible to fill. Alexander no longer saw himself as the victim of an image crisis. He saw himself as the defendant in a story that silently claimed his oldest debt: to remember where he came from and to acknowledge the one who offered him a chance when he had nothing. And as this truth took root within him, the millionaire began to change not only his routine but his very essence. It was as if he were shedding, little by little, every layer of arrogance he'd accumulated over the years. Because now, more than rebuilding his reputation, he wanted to find Mary. Not to repair his public image, but to repair himself. Weeks turned into months, and Mary's silence continued to haunt Alexander like a shadow. He could no longer stand the glittering corridors of the mall, the fake smiles at meetings, and even the applause at gala. Dinners sounded like mockery. It was during a rainy night, similar to the one where it all began, that fate decided to bring their paths together again. Alexander had left without bodyguards or a driver, simply walking the wet streets of New York, trying to rediscover the city as an ordinary man. He stumbled into a small corner cafe, the kind that rarely attracts the attention of those who are always on the run. The smell of fresh bread and freshly brewed coffee enveloped him, bringing back memories of simplicity. And there, at one of the tables in the back, sitting with the same old notebook in front of her, was Mary. For a moment, the world stood still. The sound of the rain hitting the glass seemed to fade. The voices around them grew distant, and there was only her gaze slowly rising to meet his. Mary showed neither surprise nor fear. There was a serenity in her eyes that immediately disarmed him. It was as if she had known this moment would come. Alexander hesitated. His hands trembled, something they hadn't done since his youth. He walked toward her in silence, his heart racing with each step. As he approached, Mary closed the notebook and held it tightly, as if it held more than just words, her entire story. "Mary," was all he could say, his deep voice cracking under the force of his emotion. She remained silent for a few seconds, simply watching him. Then she replied, with an almost cutting calm, "I knew you would come. Sooner or later, the weight of the past always finds those who try to escape it." Those words pierced Alexander like blades. He wasn't facing a helpless victim, but a woman who bore the dignity of all the pain she'd endured. He sat across from her, and the silence between them was more eloquent than any speech. The cafe patrons, oblivious to the drama, continued their conversations, but for Alexander and Mary, time seemed suspended. He tried to explain, but his sentences tumbled together. He spoke of his public downfall, his shame in the headlines, the constant memory of his mother, the silent debt that gnawed at him. Mary listened without interrupting, her eyes fixed on his as if to measure every word, every gesture. When he finally fell silent, exhausted, she took a deep breath and said, "You don't need to justify yourself to me. You need to justify yourself to yourself." The response was like a blow. Alexander realized it wasn't Mary who was condemning him. It was himself. And in that modest cafe, amid the smell of bread and the distant sound of rain, he understood that this reunion wasn't about apologizing, but about acknowledging the truth. Mary wasn't seeking revenge. She wasn't trying to humiliate him. The simple fact that she was there, before him, was proof that life's poetic justice was being served in silence. For a few moments, no one spoke. There was only the sound of their breathing, the weight of memories, and the strange feeling that from that moment on, nothing would be the same. The reunion brought no ready-made answers. It brought only the certainty that the past had finally knocked on the door of the present, and that the future would depend on the decision Mary was about to make. The cafe seemed suspended in time. People came and went. The barista prepared drinks. Rain dripped down the window, but for Mary and Alexander, none of this existed. Only the weight of the history that bound them and the anticipation of a decision that would change everything. Alexander, his eyes fixed on her, waited for an answer that seemed never to come. He didn't apologize directly, but his posture, his trembling voice, the vulnerability exposed in his hunched shoulders, spoke louder than any speech. Mary held the old notebook in her hands. That simple object held her entire life, childhood memories, notes from days of hunger, little dreams scribbled in the early hours of the morning when her sister slept beside her. She remembered the greedy-eyed boy who had once walked past her mother's diner, hungry and embarrassed, and the powerful man who now sat before her, silently begging for something no amount of money could buy. Mary's heart was divided. On one side, the open wound from the humiliation at the mall, the cruel memory of the laughter and scornful looks she would never forget. On the other, the memory of her mother's generosity, who never spared any effort to feed those in need, even though she had almost nothing. If she followed only the pain, she would choose the path of a final goodbye. If she followed her mother's memory, perhaps she would find the strength to offer forgiveness. Alexander couldn't bear the silence any longer. "Mary, I don't know how to undo what happened, but I know I need to change. I need to be different from the man I was that day. I need to honor what your mother meant to me." His voice broke, and Mary closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the burning tears. When she opened her eyes, her decision was already made. Mary would not beg for attention, would not lower herself to receive crumbs of guilt transformed into charity, nor would she seek revenge, because she knew that life, with its silent justice, had already made Alexander experience the weight of the fall. She chose the only response that conveyed the dignity of her story: to rise. Mary stood slowly, pushing back her chair. She tucked her notebook into her worn bag, and before leaving, looked him straight in the eye. "It's not me who needs to forgive you, Alexander. It's you who needs to learn to forgive yourself." Her voice was firm but laced with a cutting sweetness, like someone offering not a punishment, but an inescapable truth. She walked to the cafe door, and the sound of the bell announced her departure. Alexander remained motionless, feeling his heart pierced by that sentence like a just and inevitable sentence. Mary didn't hug him, didn't kiss him, didn't give him the absolution he might have expected. She gave him something much more profound: the chance to rebuild himself alone, without ties, without illusions, without crutches. Mary's decision wasn't revenge or absolute forgiveness. It was a choice of dignity, and by leaving him seated at the empty table, she showed that sometimes the most powerful gesture isn't accepting or rejecting, but simply moving forward, carrying one's own truth without needing applause. Night was falling over New York, and the rain had stopped, leaving puddles of water that reflected the city lights like fragments of a broken sky on the ground. Alexander walked alone through the streets, without security guards, without drivers, only the distant sound of traffic and the echo of his own footsteps. His impeccable suit was wrinkled, his tie forgotten in his pocket, and his eyes lost in thoughts no one else could hear. In the reflection of a closed shop window, he saw his own image, not the respected millionaire, but a tired, vulnerable man, stripped of the masks he'd always worn. For a moment, he thought he saw Mary's shadow behind him too, but when he turned, there was only the cold dawn wind. In a rare gesture, he entered a small neighborhood bookstore, still open. He walked to a plain shelf, pulled out a brown-covered notebook, and bought it without bargaining. Upon leaving, he sat on a park bench and, with the pen borrowed from the clerk, wrote the first sentence on still blank pages. His hands trembled, but he wrote as if he were recording a promise, something no one else would see, but that would change the course of his own life. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Mary walked with her worn purse slung over her shoulder. Her mother's photograph rested inside, protected as always. She stopped in front of a lit shop window and, by reflex, saw her own face. There was no sadness nor euphoria, only firmness. She touched the glass lightly, as if making a silent pact with herself, and walked on, disappearing into the anonymous crowd of the night. Life's invisible camera seemed to move away, capturing the two figures on different trajectories. He seated, writing alone for the first time in a long time. She, walking steadily, carrying dignity in every step. No words needed to be spoken. Silence was enough. And so, amidst the artificial lights of the city that never sleeps, fate sealed its poetic justice, not with shouts nor with public promises, but with the simple and relentless power of each person to follow their own path.